Hello, my name is Mr. Haynes. I'm a math teacher in Georgia, and I'm creating this video to help students learn how to hand calculate their grades that are percent weighted. This is a common question that I come across, and I just wanted to do a quick video explaining how a grade is calculated. The computer does all of the work, but I want to make sure that my students can do it by hand if necessary. And also maybe this will answer some of the questions that they have. Feel free to speed this up if I'm talking too slowly or going into too much detail. I'll do my best to keep it moving though. So to start off with, I'm going on the assumption that we're dealing with percent weight in each category. So for example, your teacher tells you that tests count 30% of your grade and quizzes count 20% of your grade and classwork counts 10% of your grade, something like that. That's a percent weight. Another common system is total points. That's actually much easier for you to calculate your grade because you simply add up the number of points that you have earned and divide that by the total number of points possible. However, that is harder for a teacher to do because they have to know exactly what they're going to do for the entire semester, exactly how many grades, exactly how much each one is going to count. And I've seen more errors in that system and things that are unfair for the student. So personally, I use a percent weight in each of the categories that I want, and I think most teachers do that as well. I'm also assuming that each of the grades within each of the categories is equally weighted. So for example, I'm assuming that a teacher doesn't put in a quiz grade and say, okay, this quiz is going to count as 2 grades, but they only put one number in. They just tell the system to double weight it. I'm going to assume that any grades that you see are counted exactly once. So if there are 5 quizzes listed in your quiz category, each quiz is equal to each other. Not one of them doesn't count more or have more weight than the other one. I'm also going to assume that whatever class you're taking, you know the percentages in each category that you're going to have. If you're not sure, I would suggest that you look at the course syllabus. So for my students, that should be in the course documents folder on the course page, or all else fails, you can ask the teacher, but more than likely the teacher is going to have to look up the course syllabus and see what your percentages are, especially if the teacher teaches multiple classes. So let's get to it. I think the best way probably to handle this is going to be to look at an example. So let's say that you are a student in this mythical Mathematics 3 course. These are the percentages for the course, and you can read those yourself. Now you can adapt these percentages to whatever class that you're taking. So for example, if your class counts classwork as 10%, then you're going to be able to follow the same steps. You just change it to 10%. Or maybe you're taking a language arts class where you have a major project that counts 10% of your grade and some of the other percentages are less than that. That's fine. Just make those changes. You can follow the same system we're going to be looking at. About the only important thing in this juncture is that all of the percentages do need to add up to be 100%. So quickly, what am I going to do? Now don't freak out, and you don't have to do all this on your own, but some people just want to know how to do it and they don't want to see my example. So here's how to do it. So if you need to calculate your grade, first thing you're going to do is you're going to find the average grade, what's called the mean, but most students know this as the average of each category, and then do not round that number. So for example, if you have 5 test grades, you're going to add together the 5 test grades and divide by 5. That's going to give you a number. For example, that might give you 82.51, for example. And so you're going to do that for each category. If let's say you're only halfway through the semester and you don't have a multiple choice final exam grade yet, that's okay. That's a 0 because you don't have anything yet. So just you can count it as 0 or you can ignore it. You'll see in our example how we handle it. Once you have the mean or average in each category, you're going to multiply each category's average by its percent written as a decimal. So for example, let's say from step 1 that you got that your test average was 82.51. Since tests count 40%, you would multiply that number by 0.4 and then get that value. And you're going to do that for each of the categories that are listed. Once again, if you do not have a grade in one of those categories, you can just write 0 for right now. Once you get that, you're going to add together all of the numbers from step 2. So you're going to add together all of the averages multiplied by the percent weight. You're going to add all of those numbers together. Probably if you add all of those numbers together, there's a good chance, especially early in the semester, that that number is going to be way less than a passing grade, even if you have decent grades. But here's what you have to do. If the total percentage of the grade possible is less than 100%, you're going to have to divide the sum that you just got by the current percent possible written as a decimal. Okay, so let's say, for example, you have test grades, quiz grades, and classwork grades, but you don't have anything from midterm or performance exam or multiple choice final. So what you would do, let's say you added together everything from step 3 and you got 63.58. Well, since only 75% of your grade is possible, and where am I getting that? Tests are 40%, quizzes are 30%, classwork is 5%. That's a total of 75% of your grade. You would take that 63.58 and divide it by 0.75. Once you get that quotient, that will be your current class average as listed in the system. Any value greater than 0.50 should round up to the next whole number. So even if you're doing this by hand, if you got, for example, the 83.51624 as your overall average, odds are the computer system is going to write 84 as your class average, okay, because the 83.51 is greater than 0.5, so it's going to round up to the next number. Of course, that also means if you have a number less than 0.5, it's going to round down to the lower integer number. Okay, so that is the quick way of kind of explaining it. Let me go through some examples and show you how it works. And feel free, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Feel free to pause, rewind as you need to, etc. So I'm going to have a mythical student, and her name is Michelle Malone. Okay. And at the 6 weeks mark, which is 1/3 of the way through the semester, she has the following grades. So notice she has 4 grades in her classwork category, two quiz grades, 2 test grades. Since she's only at 6 weeks and a semester is typically 18 weeks, she does not have a midterm grade, a performance exam grade, or a final exam grade. So here's how Michelle could hand calculate her grade. So first thing she needs to do is calculate her classwork average and then multiply that by 0.5. So if she does that, she would add together the 4 grades in the classwork category and divide that by 4. That gives her a 95 classwork average. She would then multiply that by 5%, which is 0.05. That gives her 4.75. Okay, remember that number. Now we do the same thing for quizzes. Add the 2 quiz grades together, divide by 2. That's 90. Multiply that by 0.3, which is the 30% weight for quizzes. That gives you 27. And then for tests, add together the 2 test grades, divide by 2, and you can see that gives you 34. Since you don't have a midterm grade, performance exam grade, or final exam grade, we just ignore those. Now what you're going to do is you're going to add together these 3 numbers, so 4.75, 27, and 34. You're going to add those together. Now we need to divide by the total percent possible at this point of the course. Well, since you only have the total of 75%, so that's 0.05 plus 0.3 plus 0.4, the 3 categories we know. So we're going to take the sum of our 3 numbers that we have here, and we're going to divide that by the percent possible at this point of the semester, which is 0.75. When you do that division, that comes up to 87.6 repeating, So that would round up. The system should show 88 as her current class average. So a little bit to note here, and I'll put it down here. One issue that students have at the beginning is when they have very few grades, they will complain that, oh, my average jumped 10 points. My grade jumped 8 points after that one grade. Well, sure, that's because you have fewer grades in each category. But also you need to realize that the categories that you have actually count more than what is listed in the syllabus. These actual percentages, these actual percent weights that you see over to the left, technically they will not be valid until you have a grade in every category. And truthfully, at this, really, that's going to be at the very end of the semester when you have a final exam grade. So for example, for Michelle at the 6 weeks mark, sure, tests are 40% of her overall grade, but only 0.75 or 75% is available at this point. So actually, her average for her 2 test grades here is actually over half of this 88 current average that she has. In fact, it's 53.33% of her overall grade. Quizzes count 30% out of the 75% that she currently has grades in. So quizzes actually count 40%. So the average of these 2 grades make up 40% of her grade. And then classwork is going to be 5% at the end of the semester, but currently it's actually 6 2/3% of her grade at this point. Notice all of these still do add up to 100%. But because we do not have grades in all categories, technically these percentages are actually higher than the actual syllabus number. And that's fine, because as you get more grades into these other categories, I'll show you how these numbers change a little bit as we go along. Okay, well, let's advance a little bit further into the semester. Let's say Michelle is now at 12 weeks. So she's at 12 weeks. She's 2/3 of the way through the semester. Notice she has more classwork grades, she has more quiz grades, she has more test grades, and she now has a midterm grade. Still does not have the performance exam and final exam because those typically happen at the end of the semester. So let's go through the calculations. Same thing we did before. For classwork, we need to add together the 8 grades that she has and divide by 8. You should get 91.25. Multiply that by 5%. Notice this number is slightly different than what we had before. For her quiz grades, add together the 4 quiz grades, divide by 4. That should give you 85. Multiply that by 30%, 0.3, 25.5. For test grades, we add together her 4 test grades, divide by 4. That is an 80 average. Multiply that by 0.4. We have 32. And unlike at the earlier number, we now have a midterm grade. So that is 80% multiplied by 0.05, which is 4. Once again, we're going to add together these 4 numbers. We need to divide by the percent possible. And notice now we have an additional 5% that's possible of the grade. So you're actually going to divide down here by 0.8. So when you get the sum of these numbers, divide by 0.8, this now becomes 82.578125. Since this is 0.57, that's higher than 0.5. The system should show an 83 for her overall grade. Going back over here just to kind of note what we looked at before, notice now since we have added midterm to the calculation, notice now tests actually count slightly less. Now they are 50% of the overall grade. So notice it is moving closer to the 40% that we actually have. Same thing with quizzes, classwork, and midterm. Notice that instead of them counting 5%, they count just slightly more than 6% at this point. All right, well, hopefully you've kind of got the idea of what's going on. So let's see what happens at the end of the semester. So we've made it to the 18 weeks mark. Notice that Michelle has now taken her performance exam and has taken her final exam, and she now has grades. So this is typically the easier time to calculate the grades, but we follow the same system that we did before. So for her classwork, we add together her, I believe now 12 classwork grades, divide by 12. That's a 92.5 average. Multiply that by 5%, gives us this number. We do the same thing for quizzes. 86.6 repeating. Notice I am not doing any rounding. And keep in mind, the computer system will also not do any rounding. It will use a lot of decimal places. So when you're doing these calculations, you do not want to round until your very final answer. Test grades. She has a couple of more test grades. That is her new test average. Notice once again, I am not rounding at this point. Midterm, same number as we had before. But now we have a performance exam number, and there's only one grade. We multiply that by the 5%, and we have a final exam grade. Multiply that by 0.15. Notice now we add together these 6 numbers. We now have a grade in each of the categories, so notice we are dividing by 1.00 or 100%. So her total average is possible, and now since there is a grade in every category, now each of these averages match up to our syllabus percentages that we had earlier. And when we make this calculation, this gives us 86.2083. Then the 3 starts repeating. Since 0.208 is lower than 0.5, it would round down, showing her to have an overall class average of 86 at this point. So that's the way you go about calculating your grade overall. I want to show one additional example here. Let's say that the teacher says in the syllabus that the teacher is going to drop the lowest quiz grade, drop the lowest classwork grade, and also the teacher is going to allow the final exam to replace the lowest test grade. Before I do this calculation, I do want to point out one thing. I want you to remember, Michelle has an 86 without any of these changes. Okay, so keep that number in mind, 86 without any of these changes. So how do you account for these changes? Well, we just go in. If she's going to drop the lowest classwork grade, notice that's a 70. Notice how I've crossed that out. She's going to drop the lowest quiz grade, so I've crossed that out. And it's going to replace the lowest test grade with the final exam grade. So notice I have crossed out the lowest test grade, but the final exam grade was 90. I have added an additional test grade of 90 here. Now we redo the calculations that we did earlier. So classwork becomes that with the lowest grade dropped. So notice this number has increased slightly. Quizzes are now this. That has now increased slightly. Tests are now this. That has also increased slightly. Midterm, performance exam, final exam are all the same as they were on the previous slide. Now we do this calculation, and we have 88.6439. 0.64 is higher than 0.5 to get to a final course average of 89. Now, if you remember, I said, please remember the grade that you had earlier. If you remember, that was 86. Notice that by doing these drops and this replacement, this student's overall grade increased by 3 points. Okay, so usually when we have these percentages and changes, that's what we're doing as teachers is we're trying to give you a little final boost at the end. Also, I want to give my students a chance, for example, to if you have a bad day on a quiz or a bad day on a classwork or even a bad day on a test, it's not going to hurt you at the end. I'm going to go through and do a replacement. But notice when you do these replacements, it's not going to change your grade by 7, 8 points or 10 points or something like that. If you're going into the end of the semester with an 80, you're not going to be able to get to 90 with these replacements. So I think this is a good example that if you do replacements, that it's possible to increase your grade by maybe 3 points like this example. But one thing I do want to point out is notice that the grade that was dropped is pretty far off from the actual average that you have. So here's the thing. if your dropped grade is really close to the average that you have in the category, it's not going to make much of a difference. Where these drops and replacements help is when the grade that is dropped or replaced is very far off from the average in the category. So oftentimes students who are doing very well in a class and have high averages in each category, the drops and the replacements don't make a huge difference. Same thing for if a student has lots of low grades in every category and then they have a drop and a replace. It might help them a little bit, but it's not going to help a whole lot. Where doing these drops typically makes the best benefit is when you have, say, one bad day or one bad grade in each of the categories. That's when it's going to make the most difference. So when you then go to your teacher and say, well, is there any way this can come up to a 90? Just keep in mind, your teacher already gave you a pretty good chance. By doing those drops, your grade went up 3 points already. So you're asking the teacher to then add on another point. So just keep in mind, you're not asking your teacher to change an 89 to a 90. You're asking a teacher to change an 86, which is what you originally earned, into a 90. Okay? And I'll be honest, as a teacher, what I personally do, and this is not necessarily what every teacher does, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to look at your test average. And do you see how this test average is about 87? And you ended up with a final course grade after drops and replacements of 89? If your test grade average is below 90, it's going to be very difficult to justify moving that grade anymore. Now, that's my opinion. That's not necessarily what other teachers will do, or they might put other things into consideration, but just kind of keep that in mind. All right, I hope that helps, at least in terms of how to calculate these things. Just a couple of notes here at the end. I have students who ask me all the time, well, how can I get my grade higher? Can I do extra credit? Can I do extra credit? Here's the thing. You need to earn as much of the original given credit before you ask for extra credit. I personally, as a teacher, am not impressed when a student asks for extra credit when they don't even complete the regular credit offered. The students are making low grades in all of their categories, or, for example, they have classwork grades that they didn't complete and they have zeros or not turned in grades for those. So teachers are a little bit we don't really like to deal with that, but I will give you some pointers here to think about, at least mathematically. First of all, the category that has the highest percentage is going to move your grade the most. So remember earlier I mentioned that test grades, when you only have a few categories in, your test grades counted as 53%, a little over 53% of what your course average was. So if you remember, there were 2 test grades when we did that first calculation. The average of just those 2 grades are what made up over half of what that overall grade was. So if you can do significantly better on those, that's going to have the best chance of doing it. So for example, in our example, since tests counted the most, getting a very high test grade is going to have the best chance of moving your grade either higher, or if you do a really poorly on a test, it's going to move your overall grade lower. Whereas getting a high classwork grade probably isn't going to make much of a difference. Another thing is since we use the average or the mean for each of the categories, mathematically, a mean is severely affected by outliers, which are numbers that are very far away from the average. So let's say, for example, you have an 85% test average. If you make an 88 on your next test, since that's very close to your current test average, it's not going to make much of a difference in your overall grade. However, if you have an 85 test average and you make, say, a 100 on your next test, then I would think your overall class average would probably move up several points. But also keep in mind, it also works the other way. If you have an 85 test average and then you make a 65 on your next test, well, that's going to pull your test average lower. And remember, that's counting a large part of your grade, so there's a very good chance your grade could drop several points there. So just kind of keep that in mind. Um, Something else that happens, if a new grade in a category is higher than your course average, it may not make your overall average increase. Let me give you an example. Let's say that your overall average is 85 and your current quiz average is 90. Okay, so when we do go through and do those, add together and divide for your quiz grades, you get a 90%. If you make a 90 on your latest quiz, now notice 90 is higher than your overall 85% average. However, notice that 90 is exactly the same as your quiz average. Your overall grade is going to remain the same because your quiz average is going to remain the same. So just because you make higher grades in one category doesn't mean that your overall average is going to move when you're using this weighted grade system. So just kind of keep that in mind. Especially with, say, classwork or something. Remember, classwork is only about 5 to 6% of your grade overall. And typically, I would think your classwork average is already pretty high. So just because you do make a 100 on a classwork grade does not mean your overall average should be moving up 5 or 6 points. And mathematically, it won't. One final thing, and this is the most common question I get toward the end of the year. And I've got asterisk here. This is kind of like a wild card. You can kind of fill in the number there. So if a student might ask me, can I make a 90 in the class if I make a 95 on the final exam, for example, is what they ask me. Well, you now know how to hand calculate your grade. So you can go back to what we did in these earlier slides. You can make the changes in the calculation yourself and then see what happens. See if that actually will influence and make the grade go up as much as you want to. Now, this does take a little while, and it may be more trouble than it's worth, but if you want to factor in replacements and all of that, at least you have a way of doing it. And this is something that maybe a spreadsheet might be good for in terms of calculating grades, calculating averages, that sort of thing. That might make the most benefit to you here. All right, well, thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful to you, and my intention was to do this so hopefully any parents listening or any students listening, you can go back and follow and kind of see how this works. I did my best on these calculations. I just did them one afternoon. I tried to check my answers, but if I miscalculated on one of the numbers, I apologize that I miscalculated. However, the method that I am using is valid, and that is the way that this works and how the computer systems go through. And this is how they calculate an overall grade using a percent weighting system. Well, thank you for listening, and if you have any further questions, make sure to talk to me, or if I'm not your teacher, that you talk to your regular teacher about it just to make sure you have everything set. Thank you.